Spiritual Ministration Chapter 2 Initiation into Tapomarg. The life of Satyaraju so far is the ordinary story of an ordinary village boy. Though Satyaraju undoubtedly possessed certain exceptional qualities of character, there was nothing discernible in his mental makeup or in the course of his life taken so far, which would mark him out as one destined for a life of spiritual striving and extraordinary spiritual attainments. On the contrary, his ambitions and endeavors until now were solely centered around redeeming his family from poverty and on ensuring for them a prosperous future. But fate had decreed otherwise. As subsequent events will show, Satyaraju had come to this world for an altogether different purpose. He was destined to follow the path trod by the ancient seers of Bharatvarsh, for he belonged to that elite company of Mahatmas, Rishis and Maharishis, who have in unbroken succession blessed the sacred soul of our country from the very beginning of time. Those who are interested in astrology and allied sciences would in all likelihood be aware of a remarkable collection of writings on this subject known as the Bhrigu Nadi and the Kumar Nadi. The Bhrigu Nadi is reputed to have been written by sage Bhrigu and is in Sanskrit. The Kumar Nadi similarly is reputed to have been written by Kumar Swami and is in classical Tamil. Both these works deal with astrological predictions based on individual horoscopes, and if the relevant horoscope can be traced, an unbelievably accurate and detailed account can be found in it of the past births, present life and future births of the person concerned. In this context, it is mentioned as a matter of interest that many years later, when the Bhrigu Nadi and the Kumar Nadi pertaining to Satyaraju's horoscope were taken out and read, the Pandits reading them out, as also those listening to them, were alike awed and wonderstruck by the divine personality of him that the horoscope revealed. It is also interesting to note that both the Bhrigu Nadi and the Kumar Nadi corroborated each other. Speaking of the past, the Nadis revealed that Satyaraju had taken 27 earlier births which read like a spiritual who's who. Those former births were Sanaka, one of the four sons of Brahma, Sukha Mahamuni, the son of Vyas, who propagated the Srimad Bhagavatam to Parikshit, Shivadev, Jnaneshwar, Jayanti, Tulsidas, renowned as the author of the Ramcharitmanas, Kabir, the well-known poet saint, Rajabhushan, Namdev, Mahadev, Jayachandra, Mahabala, Nityananda, Bhavananda, Sri Chandra, the eldest son of Guru Nanak, who founded the Udasi sect of sannyasis. This birth is also referred to by Tapaswiji Maharaj, who will be later mentioned in this book. Lahiri Maharaj, the Param Guru of Swami Yogananda. Parameshwar Prasad, Ram Shastri, Guru Arjun Dev, Shivaji, the great king and hero of Maharashtra, Gadadhar, Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa, Panni Mohan Bhattacharya, and finally the present birth as Satyaraju. Writing about the present birth, both the Nadis accurately describe the initiation into Tapomarg and devote an entire chapter entitled Balayogi Bhava Charitra, which gives a detailed account of the tapasya that Satyaraju would undertake. After completion of this tapasya, the Nadis predict a life devoted to spiritual ministration and spiritual upliftment of all mankind, both in India and abroad. The initiation, Sunday, 7th August 1949. The foregoing account of the Nadis and their predictions has been included as a matter of interest only. The authenticity one attaches to these is a matter of one's personal belief. In any case, at the time we write about all these events lay in the future. On Sunday, 7th August 1949, Shravan Shukla Chaturdasi of Virodhi Samvatsara, Satyaraju was exactly 14 years, 6 months and 14 days old. Nothing had happened in his life so far to presage the extraordinary events of this momentous day, as consequence of which an ordinary village boy was transformed into a Balayogi and was to eventually emerge after a period of 12 years of tapasya as a Siddha Purush and Jivan Mukta, known to the world as Sri 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 Sivabalayogi Maharaj, and to his disciples and followers as Sri Swamiji. It is best to recount the happenings of this day in Swamiji's own words. On the day preceding the great event, that is Saturday, 6th August 1949, there was no inkling in my mind of what was in store for me the next day. I was preoccupied with the thought that I had to go to Kakinada and bring back my mother and Nanaji, maternal grandfather, as I would require money for this trip. I spent most of the day collecting dues from the people who owed me money for purchases made from my shop. On Sunday, the 7th of August 1949, I had a light breakfast of rice and curds and went out to play with my friends. We played marbles from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. I appeared to have a winning streak that day and won all the games. Around 2 p.m. I began to feel hungry, so I decided to go home. I retained the cash I had won but distributed the winnings of marbles among my friends. I then bought some vegetables and took them home to my sister to be cooked for my lunch. While I was waiting for my lunch to be ready, my friend Gangaraju came to my place and suggested that I accompany him for a bath in the Godavari Canal, which flowed on the outskirts of the village. I replied that I was feeling rather hungry and weak, and hence did not feel inclined to go. However, Gangaraju persisted, and as my sister said that lunch would not be ready for another half hour at least, I agreed to accompany Gangaraju. When we reached the canal, we found the game of marbles was still going on, and we joined in. I again won. It was now nearing 3 p.m. and I was feeling very hungry. I purchased and ate 2 vadas and drank a cup of coffee from a nearby hotel with the money I had just won. We then started off at the canal for our bath. On the way, there was a grove of palmyra trees, and as we were passing this grove, 3 palmyra fruit fell down of their own accord. The boys who were with me ran to pick them up, and as I was the acknowledged leader of our group, they brought the fruit over to me. A palmyra fruit can be broken into 4 equal pieces, and as there were 12 of us, including myself and Gangaraju, I distributed 12 pieces equally, taking 1 for myself. After the snack of vadas and coffee at the hotel, I had lit a cheroot and was smoking it. With the cheroot stuck in my mouth, I peeled the palmyra fruit and started squeezing it to extract the juice. Just then, for no accountable reason, my body began trembling all over. I was wondering what had happened to me when all of a sudden I saw a jyoti or light emerging from the fruit in my hand. Almost simultaneously, the Omkar Dwani or sound of Om also started coming from the fruit. Mesmerized, I continued to stare at the palmyra fruit. The divine light and sound emerging from the fruit engulfed me in blissful waves, as a result of which the trembling of my body ceased and my mind became calm and peaceful. As I continued to observe this strange phenomenon, the fruit I had been holding disappeared, and I saw instead a Shivalinga in my hand. This Shivalinga was black in color and approximately a foot or a foot and a half in height. The Omkar Shabd continued to resound all the while, and the Shivalinga continued to emit the same dazzling light. I was watching the Shivalinga intensely when all at once it broke into 2 half pieces and fell apart. It was at this time, I think, that the palmyra fruit also fell from my hand, and a man in the attire of a Jangam Devar stood before me. This man was well over 7 feet tall, with a strong, well-knit and beautifully proportioned body. He had a dark complexion and was extremely handsome and attractive, with large and beautiful eyes. His long jata or matted hair worn by yogis was piled up on his head in the manner of the rishis of yore. He had a necklace of rudraksha beads and a small Shivalinga suspended from this necklace, resting on his broad chest. He wore a white dhoti, again in the manner of the old rishis. A bright effulgence emanated from his being which blotted out all other vision. I could only see this yogi surrounded by a bright radiance and nothing else. The yogi spoke to me in Telugu and asked me to sit down. I asked, "Why do you want me to sit down?" But the yogi again repeated his command to sit. So I sat down. He then told me to sit in the Padmasana, the lotus posture. I replied that I did not know how to sit in the Padmasana. Thereupon, the yogi placed my feet in the correct position and made me sit in the Padmasana. He then told me to close my eyes. I once again protested, "Why do you want me to close my eyes?" He replied, "Close your eyes and then I will tell you." So I closed my eyes. He then touched me at the Brakuti, the spot between the eyebrows, with his middle finger and gently tapped me on the head. Immediately I lost outer consciousness and went into deep samadhi. I became totally unaware of my body and my surroundings. All I could see was the same black Shivalinga that had appeared earlier in my hand, surrounded by dazzling light. And all I could hear was the Omkar Dwani. My mind was completely absorbed in this vision and sound, to the exclusion of everything else. While this spiritual drama was being enacted, it is interesting to note that the other boys, the playmates of Satyaraju, heard or saw nothing. They were absorbed in eating their share of the palmyra fruit or in simply playing around. However, they soon noticed that Satyaraju, instead of joining them in their play, was sitting apart in a yogic posture with eyes closed. Thinking that he was play acting the role of a sadhu, they first began to tease him, and when they got no response, they became more rough. Some tried to pull him out of his Padmasana posture, while others punched and slapped him. Finding him unmoved, they then smeared the juice of the palmyra fruit and mud brought from the canal all over his body. When Satyaraju failed to react to even this, they carried him bodily to the canal and then put him in the water. But Satyaraju was totally unconscious of all this ill treatment being meted out to him by his playmates, and hence there was still no response from him. By now it became apparent to the boys that this was no play acting on Satyaraju's part, but at the same time they could not make out what came over him. His unconscious and seemingly lifeless condition frightened them. Apprehensive that they might be accused of having caused this condition, they washed off the dirt they smeared on his body and carried him out of the canal and seated him on the canal bund. They then ran home and informed his relatives that something strange and inexplicable had happened to Satyaraju. It will be recalled that Satyaraju's mother and maternal grandfather had both gone to Kakinada. So when the news about Satyaraju's strange condition reached his home, his uncle, accompanied by 4 or 5 other persons, went to the spot where Satyaraju was sitting in samadhi. Bewildered and not knowing what to do, they simply stood around watching him. One among them, a person named Goramalana, ventured to suggest that Satyaraju had been possessed by a ghost or a spirit. In order to exorcise this supposed spirit, he began belaboring the boy with a stout wooden club that he was carrying. In the process, he accidentally struck Satyaraju in the same spot between the eyebrows where the boy's divine guru had touched him. As a result of this blow, Satyaraju's deep samadhi broke and he regained just enough consciousness of his surroundings to realize that some people were standing around him, but that was about all. The vision of the Shivalinga, surrounded by dazzling light, continued as before, and this obstructed his normal vision. He vaguely recognized his uncle among the group around him, and he asked him for a dhoti to put on in place of the shorts he was wearing. His uncle gave him a piece of cloth that he was carrying, and when Satyaraju got up to put on the cloth, 2 among the group caught hold of him by the arms, one on either side, and more or less carried him home. All this while those who had come to see Satyaraju were pestering him with all sorts of questions in order to decipher the strange condition which they found him. Some asked him if he had been possessed by a ghost or spirit, and others asked whether the village deity had possessed him. Some others wanted to know whether he had become a sadhu, but Satyaraju made no reply. He was dimly aware of what was going on around him, and his mind, in any case, was totally absorbed in the divine vision of the Shivalinga that remained continuously in front of his eyes. When the party reached Satyaraju's house, the boy found that his legs had become stiff like wood, and he could not negotiate the veranda steps. So he was carried up onto the veranda, but as they tried to take him inside the house, his legs got stuck on the door. Still, and try as they might, the people who were with him could neither bend his legs nor take him through the door. After futile attempts towards this end, for over an hour, they finally gave up and decided to make him sit down in the outer veranda of the house. Even this they accomplished with great difficulty. In the meantime, word of what had happened had spread in the village, and people in large numbers thronged to see Satyaraju. They kept pestering him with the same sort of questions as had been put to him earlier, and when their questions elicited no response from Satyaraju, they began to conjecture among themselves. Some said he was possessed by some occult spirit, and others diagnosed it as hysteria, and some contemptuously dismissed it as bluff and play acting. Only one among the assembled crowd appeared to have an inkling of Satyaraju's true state. He was an old man of 60 years, a Harijan by the name Pedda Kamaraju, who made bold to suggest that Satyaraju was under some divine influence and had been transformed into a yogi. Though Satyaraju missed his midday meal as a consequence of these unforeseen events, and though he had been very hungry when he started off to have a bath in the canal, Satyaraju's appetite had vanished, and he felt no inclination to eat and declined to take any food. Notwithstanding his refusal, his relatives forced him to take some milk. Then, as time passed, the initial excitement soon wore off, and by about 8 p.m. that evening, people had begun to return to their homes, though some, more curious than the others, stayed on to see what would happen next. These people kept sitting around Satyaraju talking amongst themselves, and as the night advanced, dropped off to sleep one by one. Around 11 p.m. that night, Satyaraju had at last found himself alone, all the others having gone to sleep. The divine vision of Shiva surrounded by the bright radiance was still continuing, and so also was the Omkar Shabd. It now entered Satyaraju's mind to go back to the canal bund where the divine experience had originally been vouchsafed to him. When he got up to go, one of the boys, Govinda, also awoke and tried to follow him, but Satyaraju gave him the slip and made his way back to the same spot where his divine guru had first made him sit down. And when he sat there again, he found that he could now not close his eyes. However, this caused no hindrance to his dhyan, for he continued to see the divine vision with his eyes, and his mind remained fully absorbed in this vision. Soon after he reached the canal bund, it began to rain heavily, and the rain continued throughout the night. But Satyaraju was quite indifferent to all this. Even though he was thoroughly drenched, it did not occur to him to move to some other place where he could get shelter from the rain. The second day, Monday, the 8th of August 1949. Next morning, on Monday, the 8th of August 1949, a Harijan boy named Pantapatti Veeraraju brought and offered some raw milk, which Satyaraju accepted and consumed. Soon after, the villagers, who were curious to know what had happened to Satyaraju, came to his house, and when they did not find him at home, they came to the canal bund to see him. Finding that the boy was being drenched by the rain, they carried him to a banyan tree near the village and seated him under the tree. They then placed a palmyra leaf umbrella over him to protect him from the rain. While all this was happening, Satyaraju was aware of the activity around him, but was totally indifferent to what was going on. As his eyes continued to remain open, he could see the people around him, but only as shadowy figures sitting in the background of the bright vision that remained steadily and constantly before his eyes. If some faces came into focus, he would vaguely remember that he had seen them somewhere before, but could neither recall their names, nor did it occur to him that they were his friends or relatives or fellow villagers. For the fact of the matter was that the touch of his divine guru had obliterated these thoughts from his mind, and at one go had snapped all of his early connections. Though it rained throughout the day, Satyaraju was quite oblivious to it. He continued to sit under the makeshift shelter of the palmyra leaf umbrella, totally absorbed in the vision that he continued to see all the time. At around 9 p.m. that night, some Harijan boys who were passing by heard the Omkar Dhwani emanating from the spot where Satyaraju was sitting. Not knowing what this strange sound was, they ran and informed the people of the village. Some villagers came to investigate, and they too heard the Omkar Dhwani coming from that direction. This continued for nearly 3/4 of an hour, whilst the villagers stood at a distance, listening to it in awed silence. Eventually, when the sound ceased, they made bold to approach Satyaraju, lifted him and carried him to his house. At home, his sister gave him some milk to drink. After he had consumed the milk, the divine fervour that had gripped his mind so far abated somewhat, and as Satyaraju felt drowsy, he went to sleep. Little did he know that this was the last proper sleep that he was going to have for a long time to come, for during the 12 long years of tapas that followed, Satyaraju hardly ever slept at all. He may have dozed off once in a while for a few minutes during breaks in his samadhi, and that too without ever leaving his seat or asana, but he never lay down to sleep again for the rest of the tapas period. Third day, Tuesday, the 9th of August, 1949. After a refreshing night's sleep, Satyaraju got up, and at 6:30 a.m. he partook of a light breakfast of idlis and chutney, which his sister had prepared for him. When he had finished his breakfast, the divine vision of the Shivalinga, surrounded by light, and the sound of the Omkar Dhwani once again gripped his mind, and so he went back to the canal where he had first had the divine experience. On reaching there, he felt severe bodily discomfort, which was followed by vomiting and diarrhea. At that time, one of his playmates, Govinda, who had accompanied him, looked after him and tended to his needs. Soon after, he became absorbed in contemplation of the divine vision. Later that morning, a lady from the village came to where Satyaraju was sitting on the canal bund, and with firm faith that Satyaraju was now a Balayogi or boy yogi, she worshipped him with incense and flowers and made the offering of a coconut. Having finished her worship, she distributed pieces of the coconut as prasad. That same morning, some of the villagers, of their own accord, erected a pandal of palmyra leaves for Satyaraju under the nearby banyan tree. The construction of this pandal was completed by about 3:30 p.m. The same villagers then approached Satyaraju and requested him to sit under the newly erected pandal. Satyaraju agreed to their request and took his seat there. At around 5:30 p.m. that evening, Satyaraju's mother and grandfather returned home from Kakinada. When they were informed of the strange happenings of the past 2 days, they became greatly alarmed and immediately rushed off to the canal bund in order to ascertain the true state of affairs. On reaching there, they observed Satyaraju seated under the palmyra leaf pandal beneath the banyan tree, absorbed in samadhi. Deeply agitated, both Parvatama and Goli Satyam repeatedly called out the boy by his name, but there was no response. Satyaraju was oblivious to the outer world and totally unaware of their presence. Seeing her son in that condition, Parvatama could not control herself and became almost hysterical, weeping loudly and clasping the boy to her bosom, and began asking what had come over him to make him behave in this inexplicable manner. The loud wailing and sobbing of his mother gradually brought Satyaraju back to conscious awareness of his surroundings. Observing that her son was now aware of her presence, Parvatama beseeched him with tears copiously flowing from her eyes all the while to return home to her. Satyaraju's mind was by now totally detached from worldly relationships, and hence he was unmoved by his mother's tears and pleading. He calmly told her that he had embarked on the divine quest and that he could not leave this blessed path and go back home. Having said that, he sat back totally detached, and no amount of weeping or protestations from his mother could make him relent. Finding that the boy was firmly resolved to continue on his chosen path, his grandfather blessed him, saying that the path he had chosen to follow was no doubt excellent, and hence he should adhere to it resolutely. At the same time, he could not help expressing his disappointment. He told Satyaraju that they had looked upon him as the hope of the family and the prop of their old age. Now there was nobody to look after them. In reply to this, Satyaraju assured them that they would not have to face any problems, financial or otherwise, and that everything would be well with the family. After this brief conversation, Satyaraju closed his eyes and again passed into samadhi. The grief-stricken mother, however, could not bear to leave him sitting there and return home alone. Not knowing what to do next, nor knowing how to resolve this strange situation, she too sat down nearby, perplexed and disconsolate. From time to time, she would look at her son and then weep softly into the folds of her sari. On one such occasion, she looked up towards Satyaraju, and there suddenly flashed before her eyes the entrancing vision of the Trimurti, Brahma, Vishnu and Mahesh. Thinking that it was a hallucination, she rubbed her eyes and looked again. The vision was still there in all its dazzling splendor and soul-enthralling beauty. Now, whichever way she looked, she saw only the Trimurti and nothing else. How long this lasted, she was unable to tell, for time itself had come to a standstill. The vision made her realize that her son was under divine protection and that she need not fear for him any longer. This brought peace to her troubled mind, and she returned home happy and contented. Early difficulties. Though Parvatama was thus reassured by the divine vision, her motherly heart continued to remain solicitous about Satyaraju's well-being, and so she endeavoured to feed him and look after him. However, Satyaraju declined to accept her services and went to the extent of dissuading her from visiting him. This grieved Parvatama, but she had no choice except to comply. At this stage, Gora Mallanna, whose house was adjoining the place and where the Balayogi sat, took it upon himself to look after the young yogi. Though well-intentioned, Gora Mallanna was totally unversed in spiritual matters. It may be recalled that he was the same person who had awoken Satyaraju from his initial samadhi by striking him with a club, in the mistaken belief that he was possessed by a spirit. Now this Gora Mallanna remembered having heard somewhere that the great rishis of yore, when doing tapas, used to draw sustenance from vayu or air alone. He therefore advised Satyaraju to do likewise, and Satyaraju agreed to his suggestion. In pursuance of this suggested course of action, Gora Mallanna began to gradually reduce the meager quantity of fruit and milk that Satyaraju was taking. Eventually, he stopped giving him anything altogether, with the result that now Satyaraju was taking no nourishment at all. When Mother Parvatama heard of this, she was greatly agitated, taking some milk with her. Went to where her son was sitting and beseeched him to partake of the milk. Moved by her entreaties, Satyaraju drank the milk she had brought. This greatly annoyed Gora Mallanna, who remonstrated with the Balayogi, but Satyaraju simply answered that he would not refuse anything when it was offered to him with love and devotion. This further annoyed Gora Mallanna, who angrily retorted, "If I bring you meat, will you eat that also?" The Balayogi looked at him calmly and then said in a soft voice, "Yes, if you offer it with bhakti or devotion, I shall eat it." Gora Mallanna, however, was not mollified and stormed off home in a rage, saying that henceforth he would have nothing more to do with the yogi. From that day onwards, he stopped rendering the small services that he was doing for the yogi, but also began to actively deride him. It is a strange but inevitable fact that when an aspirant sets on the spiritual path, he always finds detractors putting obstacles in his way. This happened in the case of Satyaraju also. Though the people by and large had come to recognize Satyaraju as a Balayogi and were treating him with veneration, there were nevertheless some among them who failed to see the light. Prompted by envy or simply to create mischief, they would subject the young yogi to all sorts of torments when he was immersed in samadhi, particularly when there was no one to check their misdemeanors. When Gora Mallanna left in a huff, Mother Parvatama began ministering to the needs of her son. However, she could not remain by his side all of the time, and when she left him to go home, some of the boys who had feared and disliked Satyaraju but had not dared to show open hostility towards him earlier would now creep out and beat him to their heart's content. On one occasion, some particularly venomous individuals soaked a piece of cloth in kerosene, set it alight, and threw it on the Balayogi when he was sitting in samadhi. As Satyaraju was quite oblivious of this, of his body, he neither knew nor felt anything at the time, and so the lighted cloth caused some deep and painful burns in his hands and legs. Disregarding the excruciating pain from these burns, Balayogi continued his tapas as before. When word about this incident spread in the village, one kindly old man prepared an ointment for these burns. He came daily and applied the ointment to the affected parts, even while the yogi sat immersed in samadhi, and then quietly went back. Through the ministration of this good man, the burns gradually healed up, but the scars left by these burns can be seen even to this day. Though most people by now believed that Satyaraju was genuinely engaged in tapas, still there was the usual crop of doubters who scoffed at the whole idea. One such person was a man named Dora Veeraraju, a resident of Adivarapupeta. Dora Veeraraju decided to take it upon himself to expose the Balayogi, and for this purpose he solicited the assistance of a friend of his, one Chinta Suranna, who was an Ayurvedic Pandit hailing from Someshwara near Ramachandrapuram. One evening both these persons came to where the Balayogi was sitting under his pandal of palmyra leaves, ostensibly for his darshan, and then waited there until everybody had left. As soon as they were alone with the Balayogi, Chinta Suranna, in order to test the intensity of the yogi samadhi, pulled out his legs so as to unlock the yogi's Padmasana posture. He succeeded in pulling out the legs, but they remained where he had left them. He then tried to awaken the yogi from samadhi by prying open one of his eyelids with his fingers. His eyelid too remained half opened, but the yogi's samadhi continued undisturbed. Having some knowledge of these things, Suranna was by now convinced that the yogi's samadhi was genuine, and he felt abashed for what he had done. He now tried to close the half-opened eyelid and put the yogi back into the Padmasana posture, but his efforts were to no avail. He struggled at this task through most of the night but could not succeed. Finally, when the yogi emerged from his samadhi, Suranna fell at his feet and begged his pardon for what he had done. The Balayogi smiled and readily forgave him. The next morning, Suranna went to meet Parvatamma. He told her that her son was a Mahatma and he entreated her to look after him well. Sojourned at Pasalapudi ashram. The Balayogi put up with these varied torments for a full 2 months without letting them affect his tapas, but continued disturbances of this nature began to eventually affect his peace of mind. He would often restrain himself from going into samadhi lest his tormentors took advantage of his unconscious stage to inflict further tortures upon him. On such occasions, when he was in deep dhyana but not in samadhi, he often caught people in the act of trying to beat him, in the mistaken belief that he was lost in samadhi. The startled culprits would then plead forgiveness, and he would let them go. Be that as it may, he finally got fed up and decided to move away from there, so that he could carry on his tapas undisturbed. Ruminating in his mind as to where he would find a peaceful place for his tapas, he remembered having heard of an ashram at Pasalapudi, a village approximately 8 kilometers from Adivarapupeta, where a sadhu was reputed to be engaged in tapas. Hoping that this ashram might meet his requirement, he left for Pasalapudi at 10 p.m. one October night, barely 2 months after he had begun his tapas. He found the ashram that he was looking for, but as he entered, the sadhu who was inside began making weird noises. Apparently, the sadhu had assumed that some vagabond youngster was trying to gain entry into the ashram by stealth, and he had made these noises to frighten him away. The Balayogi, on the other hand, interpreted the strange behavior of the sadhu to imply that the sadhu did not want to be disturbed, and so the young yogi withdrew and came and sat outside. Now it so happened that during those days, communist bands used to roam the countryside in that area trying to terrorize the villagers. In self-defense, every village had organized posses of armed men who used to patrol the areas around their respective villages and apprehend any suspicious characters whom they may find loitering in or around the village. One such posse happened to pass by the ashram and saw this young boy, who was obviously a stranger, sitting outside. They immediately surrounded the boy and started interrogating him. In the state of mind in which he was, the Balayogi could barely comprehend what was going on, let alone answer their questions coherently. This strange behavior of the boy further aroused the suspicion of the villagers, and an ugly situation might have developed. Fortunately, just then one of the men recognized the boy as the Balayogi of Adivarapupeta. When the posse learned that the Balayogi had come to Pasalapudi to stay at the ashram, they called out the manager of the ashram and had the Balayogi conducted inside. After accommodating the young yogi, the manager asked him what sadhana he was practicing. The Balayogi could hardly give a satisfactory reply because he had followed no specific sadhana. He had simply become immersed in the samadhi as a result of the divine touch of his guru. So he simply answered, "I don't know." "If that be the case," said the manager pompously, "I shall initiate you. From now on, repeat the mantra, Sadguru, at all times." With that, he left him and went back to bed. Balayogi, at last finding himself alone and undisturbed, went back into samadhi. The next morning, the manager came to see him again and promptly inquired whether the Balayogi had done japa of the mantra he had given him. When the Balayogi replied in the negative, the manager was visibly annoyed. Kari Subireddy, who was the president of the Pasalapudi village council and who was also controlled the running of the ashram, visited the ashram later in the morning. On seeing him arrive, the sadhu who was staying there got up deferentially, did namaskar, and urged the Balayogi to do the same. However, the Balayogi continued sitting unconcerned, immersed in dhyana. Reddy, who was full of his own self-importance, felt offended at being ignored in this manner. Barely suppressing his annoyance, he curtly asked the Balayogi what diet he was taking. The Balayogi replied that his diet was restricted to milk only. Thereupon, he peremptorily told the Balayogi that milk could not be made available to him and that he need not stay in the ashram any longer. The attitude of these ashram functionaries made it quite apparent to the Balayogi that his presence there was not welcome, so he decided to return to Adivarapupeta. He started soon after dusk, and by 10 p.m. he was back in his native village after a brief absence of only 24 hours. On reaching the village, he did not return to his original location. Instead, he went and sat under a banyan tree on the piece of land which belonged to his uncle. One morning, when the people of Adivarapupeta learned that the Balayogi was back, they were overjoyed and came in large numbers for his darshan. The tempest. The East Godavari district, being near the sea, is often subjected to cyclonic storms. One such storm of unusual intensity struck the region sometime in November 1949. A severe gale, followed by torrential rain, swept across the countryside, starting at about 2:30 a.m. It continued unabated until 5:30 a.m. Trees were uprooted, houses collapsed, the whole area was flooded, and people were in great distress. In such calamitous conditions, Mother Parvatama naturally feared for her son's safety, and so she ran to where he was sitting, even while the storm was in full swing. It was a rash thing to do, and she narrowly escaped death when a large branch torn off by the hurricane struck her a glancing blow on the head. Though stunned by the blow, she soon recovered and, spurred on by her anxiety for her son, somehow managed to reach the banyan tree where the Balayogi was sitting. To her great wonder, on reaching there, she found that the spot around the Balayogi was an oasis of peace amidst the raging turmoil elsewhere. The Balayogi was immersed in deep dhyana, undisturbed by the havoc all around him. The place where he sat remained calm and clean, and not a leaf was disturbed under the banyan tree. Relieved and not a little astonished, Mother Parvatama went and sat near him. As the storm abated and the day dawned, she discovered in the growing light that swarms of large red ants had taken refuge in the area where the Balayogi sat. The Balayogi's body was also covered in thick clusters of these ants. This greatly perturbed Mother Parvatama, and she started brushing the ants off his body. But the Balayogi told her by a sign not to do so and to leave them undisturbed where they were. Moved to burial ground. The Balayogi continued his tapas under the banyan tree, but once again he found himself the victim of harassment by the children of the village and even by some of the older people who were not kindly disposed towards him. During the day, these people dared not to do anything, as there was a constant stream of visitors coming for the darshan of the yogi. However, they got their opportunity at night when the visitors and those looking after the Balayogi went home, and the Balayogi was left all by himself. He was thinking one day on what steps he should take to get rid of this nuisance, when it occurred to the Balayogi that if he shifted to the village burial ground, these misguided people would be afraid of following him there, particularly at night, and he might thus obtain peace. So on 18th November 1949, the Balayogi shifted the venue of his tapas to the burial ground on the outskirts of the village. His intuition proved correct, because people generally look upon burial and cremation grounds with awe and fear, and try to avoid these places if they can. Because of this fear, no one dared to go near the burial ground at night, and so the Balayogi was thus relieved of their harassment. But this relief was short-lived, for he soon discovered that the burial ground swarmed with insects and rodents, who were habituated to feeding on the flesh of the dead bodies buried there. When these insects and rodents came across the Balayogi seated motionless in samadhi for hours at a stretch, they naturally took him to be a corpse and started nibbling at his flesh, causing any number of wounds, particularly in the lower parts of his body which rested on the ground. Then when the Balayogi went for his daily bath in the canal, the fish in the water would nibble at these open wounds. In effect, what it amounted to was that through the shifting his location, he found relief from the mental harassment caused by the mischievous boys, but he had to pay for it in physical suffering caused by the insects, rodents, and reptiles inhabiting the burial ground.